So Roosevelt commanded the American military and commanded the American government as presidents during wartime have a great deal of scope for controlling the government in a way that they don't during peacetime. And you can see this to some extent in the current war in Iraq with President Bush and the greater authority that the executive branch has claimed. So Roosevelt commanded the greatest economic power in the world, the greatest military power in the world, and he commanded it more forcefully than presidents almost ever command the American system. But beyond that, it was Roosevelt who who controlled America's secret weapon. And that secret weapon was a vision of what the world could be after the war. I had an argument with a colleague about when I tried this idea out. I teach at the University of Texas, and the University of Texas, with Texas A&M every year, has this, it's a retreat of faculty members who are in the general field of national security studies. And we got together at this resort. It's nice. It's a well-endowed retreat. So we got together at this nice resort outside of Austin. And we were having this argument beside the pool, actually. And I tried out my idea that Roosevelt was the most powerful man in world history during the early 1940s. And this colleague of mine said, well, wait a minute, I'm not so sure I agree with that. How about Joseph Stalin? Joseph Stalin was effectively an absolute dictator over the Soviet Union during the same period. And although the power of the Soviet Union didn't add up to the power of the United States, if you contrast Stalin's near absolute control over the Soviet Union with Roosevelt's lesser control over the United States, Roosevelt was never a dictator. He had to share power with lots of other people, including Congress. So his argument was that if you factor in the fact that Stalin had a much greater degree of control over the Soviet Union and its military, economy, political system, and compare that with Roosevelt's lesser control over the larger system, Stalin comes out ahead. And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, yeah, but that leaves aside one very important aspect of American power, the most important aspect of American power. And you could call it, people call it various things. Sometimes it's called America's soft power, as opposed to America's hard power. I think you should call it America's moral power. The idea of what America stands for. Individual liberty, democracy, the rule of law, private property. And it's this power that Roosevelt did more than anybody else to, what shall I say, unleash on the world, spread around the world. It's a striking aspect of Joseph Stalin's power that the power of the Soviet Union, the power of Soviet communism, did not extend 1 foot beyond where the Soviet Red Army occupied. Yes, the Soviets occupied Eastern Europe and they controlled Eastern Europe. But beyond that, there was no attraction of the Soviet system. What made America powerful in the end was the idea of the United States and the idea of what America stood for. And actually, I hesitate to say even the idea of the United States. No, the ideas that America exemplified. The ideas of democracy, the ideas of the rule of law. This was the real victory of the United States in World War II. And if you want to say maybe these ideas were confirmed with the American victory in the Cold War. So you could call that World War II extended down to the late 1980s. Anyway, so that's going to be part of the story. And I hope to grab the attention of readers. Because if I make a big sweeping claim like this, then presumably people will be interested enough to keep turning the pages. And one of the things I tell my students in the writing class is the first job of any historian or any writer is to get readers to keep turning the pages. And I also tell them that when I'm talking to my graduate students for the most part, you can rely on the fact that for your dissertation you have a captive audience. Your dissertation committee has to read whatever you write. But once you get past that, then you can't rely on a captive audience, and you shouldn't. I strongly encourage my students to write for broader audiences than their fellow historical specialists. In fact, I encourage them to write for audiences like you. I don't see very many students in here, so I'm assuming that none of you was required to come tonight. You don't have to. You could stay home. You could watch TV. You could go to a soccer game. You could go fishing. You could do whatever you want on a nice night. But you chose to come because you were interested in history. And so I try to encourage my students to write for people exactly like you. People who don't have to keep turning the page. But they have to write, I have to write in a way that will get you to keep turning the pages. Okay. Having said that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I have tentatively figured out about Franklin Roosevelt. I said this was my search for Franklin Roosevelt. I'm not sure I found him yet, but I'm getting there, I hope. And it has to do with the fact that Franklin Roosevelt was famously elusive. A lot of studies, a lot of biographies of Franklin Roosevelt include something like The Puzzle of Franklin Roosevelt, or Franklin Roosevelt, The Enigma, or Franklin Roosevelt, The Mystery Behind the Man, or that sort of thing. So what is it that we make of this guy? I'll tell you some of the characteristics of his leadership style, and then I'll try to explain to you what it all means. One of the things about Roosevelt, one of the great puzzles, was why this guy turned out to be as liberal as he was. Why is he the patron saint of modern American liberalism? You never would have guessed it from his background. He was born into privilege. His family was wealthy on both sides. Both his mother and father came from wealth. He was the only child of his mother. His mother was the second wife of his father. His father was a widower when they married. He had a half-brother who was 25 years older than he was. So he grew up effectively as an only child. And he was utterly doted on by his mother. They had sufficient wealth that there was nothing that Franklin Roosevelt ever needed, nothing that he reasonably wanted that he didn't have. He had a pony. He had a sailboat. He took vacations every year in Europe. He went to Harvard as a matter of course and really didn't have to work very hard. That was back in the days when social standing was more important than academic accomplishment at Harvard. He had everything handed to him. And nonetheless, he became, what many people during his presidency described as he became a traitor to his class. He took up the cause of the common people in America when there weren't very many people of Franklin Roosevelt's uncommon background who did that. As a result, a whole lot of people that he had grown up with refused to speak to him anymore because he said, what are you doing? You are undermining the very values that established your family's fortune, that allowed you to live the life that you lived. Now, I don't have a full explanation as to why that was so. I can point out that in the Roosevelt family and in the Delano family, he was named for Delano was his mother's last name, and actually this raises an interesting point about the influence of parents on children. This is going to be a big part of my story. I really have to figure out how this person became the person he ultimately became. How? To follow up on what I established, how did this kid, born in 1882, by the way, this is the 125th anniversary year of Franklin Roosevelt's birth, how did this kid, who very easily could have spent his life just as a rich playboy, how did he become the most powerful man in the history of the world? That's sort of my search for Franklin Roosevelt. How do you get to this point? Did he know he was going to achieve that? Did he aim for that? Well, the answer to this is partly yes. It is the very rare person who becomes President of the United States who knew, who even had any reasonable expectation long in advance of becoming president that he could be president.